Welcome back everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the 13th and final round of the Tata Steel Chess Masters being held in the Netherlands. Now we've had a great tournament, but there are two players tied for lead heading into this final round, and those players of course are two of the top Indian junior players in the world, the current world chess champion Domraju Gukesh and of course Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa. Now we're going to start with the game between Gukesh and Arjun Erigaisi. Arjun came into this event as the #1 ranked player in the world with a rating of 2801, #3 as well to boot, but he's had a very rough go of it. That being said, he won a very nice game yesterday against Noterbeck, and will he be able to finish it off in style with a win against Gukesh? Or will Gukesh win this game and win the tournament? Let's jump right into the action. So the game starts out to move e4. Arjun plays e5. Let's look at it from Arjun's standpoint, since we are rooting for him, since he's having a bad tournament. We get the move knight to f3. And now Arjun plays knight f6. Now I really like Arjun's choice, especially in the latter half of this tournament when he's trying to consolidate, trying to stop the bleeding as much as he can, and he just decides he's going to be very solid here. Play the classic Petrov system, which has been employed by many players, including Fabiano Caruana, as well as Jan Nepomniachtchi in both of their world championship matches against Magnus Carlsen. So we get knight takes pawn. Arjun plays d6. We get the move knight to c4, and now we have the move knight takes pawn. We get queen to e2, queen to e7, and now we get this move knight to e3. Now this is a little bit unorthodox from Gukesh. I'm a touch surprised to see this opening here because Gukesh obviously is very well prepared for the system. In the world championship match, he did play e4 on move 1, but this doesn't seem like a cutting edge approach, and considering the stakes here where he can really supplant I guess is the right word, or maybe the wrong word I'm looking for, he can really cement his grip hold on being the world champion, being the #3 player or #2 in the world. It's a little bit surprising to see this choice. So we get knight to e3 from Gukesh here, and after the move knight to e3, now Arjun plays the move knight f6. Now the move that I expected here was the move knight c3, and after knight takes knight, b takes c3, let's say takes. Position's pretty balanced here, but white can go d4, build a bit of a white center, and honestly the computer gives white a very small advantage. I think rook b1's a little bit better first, but either way it's very playable. Instead we get the move knight to e3. Now Arjun plays move knight to f6, stopping white from going knight d5. Say you play a move like knight c6 after knight d5 here, I guess it's still okay with knight d4, but nonetheless if you were to move the queen to h4, there's knight takes pawn, your king and rook get forked. If you move the queen back to guard, then you lose the horse and the game as well. So we get knight to f6 here, stopping white from playing knight d5, and now Gukesh plays knight c3. Arjun plays move bishop e6 here, and now we get g3 with the idea of fianchettoing the bishop to g2 and using the long diagonal. Here Arjun plays knight c6, we get the move bishop to g2, and now Arjun plays queen d7. Gukesh castles, and Arjun decides to castle to the queen side. Now even though I was really complimenting Arjun on trying to be very solid, he understands that in this position it's going to be very hard here to develop on the king side. Say you play queen d7 and bishop e7 to castle. After knight d5 here, white is already putting pressure on the bishop. This isn't the end of the world, but most likely white is going to end up in a situation here where you have the two bishops in return for a bishop and a knight, and in the long term it will be easier for white to play. So Arjun castles queenside. Now we get the move b4, and due to the opposite side king castling here, this is going to be a barn burner. It is not going to be a quiet draw. One of the players is going to break through. Now unlike the game yesterday we looked at between Pragg and Serrana here, both sides are getting options to attack. White can push the pion on the queen side, black can also start pushing on the king side. So we get d5 here. Now Gukesh plays b5, knight to a5, and now we get the move d4. Important move of course, because if white plays, let's say rook d1, after d4 it's spaghetti-o time, the knights are getting forked. So we get d4 to stop black from pushing, and now Arjun plays the move bishop h3, trying to eliminate this fianchettoed bishop around the white king. Gukesh takes the bishop, we get takes, and now we have the move queen f3, and here Arjun plays h5. Now there are some shades actually of the Pragg game against Serrana, because you will notice that in this situation, let's say white were to play a4, this knight stops white from ever attacking on the queen side, whereas black can easily push this h-pawn up the board. So there is a little bit of a similarity. So after h5, Here Gukesh plays the move knight e takes d5, and this is simply a mistake here. The computer wants white to take with the c knight, and there is actually a very specific reason for this, which is that if you take the c knight and black plays the move h4, for example, white can go knight to f4, kicking the queen back. White can also potentially simply trade the knights here and then play queen to f5 here, and at this point white is much better. You have one extra pawn, even if it's only temporary, in an endgame, double stack pawns on top of each other, and white will go on to win. But when we get knight e takes d5 and the move h4 here, now white cannot play queen to f5 check. You do not have the knight on e3 covering the square, and that means that black's attack is actually going to be very fast here. So we get the move knight takes knight. Arjun takes back, and here we get the move rook d1. Now this is a serious error here already. As you can tell from the evaluation bar, Gukesh is under some serious pressure. If he were to play the move queen g2, queen f5, and g4, it's only slightly worse, because if black takes the pawn on c2, you can go bishop f4 followed by, say, queen takes knight and rook c1, hitting the pawn on c7 here, and white is doing very, very well. So back to the game. In this position, queen to g2 would have been best, but Gukesh plays the move rook d1 here, and now we get pawn takes and the move hg3. Now, while white's king is running over to f1 if black were to check here, the computer does not believe in this at all, and it's primarily because even though you aren't getting mated right away, black is going to have a serious attack, as we're about to see. So Arjun plays the move knight c4. Now Gukesh plays bishop to f4 here, and this is a move after which there is no return. Now, the move that Gukesh should have played according to the computer is rook to b1 here. This move, frankly, not human, not realistic, as it doesn't really do anything. But as we're about to see, after bishop to f4 is played, now Arjun plays the move bishop h6. White is going to have to trade off this bishop, and effectively, black's king here is very safe on the queen side, while black has access to the g and the h files, and this position is just GG already. So we get bishop takes bishop. Arjun takes back, and now we get the move queen g2. After queen g2 is played, Arjun plays queen to h5, and here it is very clear what Arjun's plan is. He wants to line up the legendary triple stack with the two rooks and the queen, everything on the h file, and white just has no attacker. The black king on the queen side, very, very safe here. Your pawns aren't up the board enough. You have no open files even, so black is just crushing. Gukesh plays rook b1. Now we get rook d to h8. Arjun sets up the legendary triple stack, and we get the move rook b4. Arjun plays knight to a3 here. Now this move might look a little bit unusual. The computer actually prefers knight d6 on the one hand, but after knight to a3, you put pressure on both the pawns on c2 and b5. But additionally, you always have this queen h1 move in your back pocket, so you don't really have to worry about the knight getting trapped or any kind of phantom attack. For example, say rook a4, you might be thinking something like knight c2 and rook a7, and white's checkmating you very quickly, but you always have the move queen to h1 to force the queens off the board. Now, if white were to play rook a4 here, black actually would not take the pawn on c2, would take on b5, because now the white knight on c3 is being attacked, and black has all kinds of threats with this nice right triangle. So after knight a3, Gukesh plays b6, and now Arjun decides to take with the c pawn. At this point, b6 is pure desperation. White doesn't have anything here. They're just losing the game, but you don't want to resign just yet. So we get b6. Arjun takes with the c pawn, and now Gukesh plays the move rook to a4, and here we get knight b5. The move rook to d3 is played by Gukesh, and now Arjun trades the knights and slides the king over to d8. Now you could of course go to b8 as well. This probably also is winning on the spot, but after you go to b8, white can at least try to go g4, opening up some threats on this diagonal from g3 towards the king on b8. So Arjun goes king d8 here, realizing that he has queen h1 check, he has queen d1 check, he's got a triple stack. White's rooks are just not active enough here, and black is going to win the game. So Gukesh plays f3. Arjun plays queen b5 here, attacking the rook, setting up a queen b1 check, but also keeping rook h1 in his back pocket as well. We get rook takes a7 from Gukesh, and now Arjun plays rook h1 check, and we get the move king f2. If Gukesh were to play queen takes rook here, after queen b1 checking the king, white moves, black takes, and after check, king d7, white cannot check the king anymore without giving up one of the rooks, and black is also threatening a checkmate. So we get king f2, and now Arjun plays rook 8 to h2, pinning the queen on g2 here, and in this position, Gukesh resigns. Same thing if you check on a8 after king d7, no checks as a king without giving up one of the rooks, and you're going to lose this queen on g2 due to the double stack on the h file. So a crushing victory from Arjun in this game. This means that he defeats Gukesh, he finishes with 2 great wins, still not a good tournament overall, but nonetheless, there is a lot to build upon from the standpoint of confidence and feeling good good about yourself. The irony, of course, is that in chess, and I know this from personal experience, when you play at the top level, there are a lot of games where you play, and when you play in these situations, when there's a lot of pressure, you tend to actually do worse than when you simply play. And with Arjun's tournament being over for quite a while, it feels like he's finally found himself. He's just playing, not worried about the rating, not worried about the standings, just playing chess, and he wins his second game in a row. So he wins the second game in a row, and meanwhile, this also means that Gukesh now has to wait and see what will Praggnanandhaa do in his game, which he's playing against Vincent Keimer. Shockingly, Pragg would go down in flames. He would lose a 7-hour game to Vincent Keimer from Germany, and with that, we end up with a tie for first place. Now, in most top-level tournaments, including Tata Steel, there is usually a tiebreaker to determine who wins the event. So let's move on to the tiebreaker. Now, some of you guys are wondering, why did I not cover the Vincent game versus Pragg? A very long game, and while it was exciting, it's going to be very difficult to cover everything. So off we go into the tiebreak. Now, the tiebreak is very simple. We will have a 2-game tiebreaker with 3 minutes plus 2-second increment. Both players will have 1 game with white and black, and let's get into the action. So if the score is 1-1, we move forward, but if we reach that point, we'll talk about it then. So first game of the tiebreaker, Gukesh with the white pieces, and he opens with the move knight f3. Pragg plays the move d5, we get c4, e6, and now we have the move g3. We get knight to f6, bishop g2, and now the move d4. Now here black has a couple of options. You could play bishop e7, castles, going into a castles, I should say, going into a classic Catalan, but Pragg decides to play d4, and after castles, knight c6, we get the move d3. Now we have bishop c5 being played. I believe this was featured in the World Championship match back in 2021, I believe it was, if I have my years correct, between Magnus and Jan Nepomniachtchi. So this is something that can be played quite frequently. We get a3, a5 played here to stop b4, and now Gukesh plays move bishop g5. We get h6, takes, and now we have the move knight b to d2. Pragg plays queen e7, we get knight to e4, and now we have move a4 on the board. Gukesh trades the knight for the bishop, we get queen takes knight, and now we have the move knight d2. Now all this pretty standard. Again, it is a blitz game. Players are trying to move relatively quickly. The good news for Pragg is that even though he lost his very tough 7-hour game to Vincent Keimer, he is still there. The adrenaline is flowing, the juice is going, and he has to be feeling like he's in the zone, whereas for Gukesh, it can be a little bit hard to switch modes. So we get the move castles. Gukesh plays queen c2, we get e5, and now we have the move rook fb1, intending to go for b4. Pragg plays rook a7 here, we get b4, takes, and now we get the move queen e7. Now the reason that Pragg played rook a7 is evident here. The rook guards the pawn on b7 so that you can move your bishop along the diagonal, and also you can try to double stack and pressure the pawn on a3. We get the move rook b5. Pragg takes on a3, we get rook e1, and now we have rook a7. Now what I think happened here is that Gukesh probably thought he could trade the rooks and take the knight here, but after takes and rook takes e5 in this position, black has to move bishop to h3, and all of a sudden this white king is getting attacked on either the b or the a file here, and white is in serious trouble. So we get the move rook to e1. Pragg plays rook a7 back, intending to finally move this bishop, and now Gukesh plays queen b2, stopping black from moving the bishop without hanging the pawn on b7. Here we get the move rook d8, Gukesh plays h4, and now we have the move knight b8. Gukesh plays e3, and we get the move c6, rook to b3, and now we have queen c7 being played. Now at this point, it is clear that Pragg is much better. He's up a pawn on the queen side, but there is this little pesky issue also known as the clock, where Pragg has 29 seconds and Gukesh has 1:07. And as I've said in many of my videos, both of recaps, but even blitz matches I play, time is surprisingly important, and in many games time is ultimately the deciding factor and not the play on the board. So we got knight f3. Knight a6 played here by Pragg. He is low on time, not sure what to do. Computer wants c5 here, overprotecting. Probably Pragg was worried about takes, and knight to e5 here, opening up some kind of big threats on this diagonal potentially, but it actually is just winning for black after the move rook to e8, pinning the knight on e5. So we get knight a6. Rook to a3 played here by Gukesh, pinning this knight so that you can't jump without hanging the tower, and now we get the move queen d6. We get the trade on d4 here, and now we have the move queen to b6 being played. Pragg goes rook to a8, does not want to hang the rook, and now Gukesh plays knight takes pawn. Now you might be thinking, why not take the rook on a3, right? But if you take the rook on a3, you hang your rook on d8, queen checks the king, attacks the bishop, you move the king, you lose the bishop in the game. And if you block with queen f8 here, white has rook to e8, winning this queen on f8, and the game will end in a couple of moves. So that's why we get rook to a8, and now Gukesh plays knight takes pawn. And this is a very important moment, because when knight takes d4 is played here, if black takes on a3, we already know the rook on d8 will hang. But if black were to take what looks like a free knight on d4, white has this tactic with rook to e8, checking the king and attacking the rook. If black takes the rook, white takes the queen, white has a queen for a rook and a knight, and white will win the game. And if black moves the king, white then plays queen takes rook. And here when we do the count, white has 2 rooks, a queen, and a bishop. Black has a rook, bishop, and knight. And the main reason I mention this is because this is a motif or a theme which is going to be overlooked later in the game by one of the players. So after knight takes d4, Pragg plays knight c7, we get rook takes rook, knight takes, and now the move queen to a7, trying to attack the knight on a8. Pragg plays knight c7, we get queen to a5, and here we have the move queen takes knight being played. We get queen takes knight, and now we get queen takes d3, rook to e7, and here Pragg plays move bishop to e6, developing the bishop and guarding the pawn on f7 from the double attacker from the queen and the rook, but also spying the pawn on c4. Now here Gukesh takes the pawn on b7, we get the move pawn to c5, and Gukesh plays queen c7. Now at this point, both players very low on time, no time advantage ever. It's going to come down to blunders, and here Pragg makes an epic mistake with the move queen d6. Now the reason that I mentioned those lines earlier is that this runs into the same tactic here, and it's mildly surprising that Pragg misses, considering that this idea occurred on a couple of moves. But he is of course tired. He has been playing for 7+ hours now in a row without a break, and he makes this fateful error with queen d6. Now Gukesh does not miss here. He plays the correct move, rook to e8, checking the king, attacking the rook again. If black takes the rook, you lose the queen and the game. So Pragg plays king to h7, Gukesh plays queen takes rook here. We get queen to e5, Gukesh plays rook h8, king g6, queen d3, bishop f5, queen e3, queen d6, and here we have the move rook e8. Pragg plays bishop e6, and after the move bishop to e4, he resigns the game here, and Gukesh gets a massive win in the first game of the tiebreaker. Now, both players very sloppy, a lot of mistakes, probably nerves, but frankly, both players are obviously tired as well. As I mentioned, it's been a very, very long day, so it's not super surprising to see. So Gukesh wins the first tiebreaker game, meaning that in the second tiebreaker game now, he is going to be playing with the black pieces, and if he draws this game or wins this game, the match ends on the spot. So Pragg opens with d4 here. After the move d4, we get knight to f6, bishop g5, and Pragg opens with the classic trump house key. Here we get d5, e3 is played, and now Gukesh plays the move g6. Now this is a little bit of an unusual setup. Normally black would play something like e6 here, knight bd7, maybe c5. g6 is definitely something a little bit off the beaten path, but it's also very creative. And the reason it's very creative here is that if white trades and tries to go for a stand-up setup with g3 and bishop g2 here, black actually is going to play something like h5, h4, and then develop the bishop to d6, maybe go c5, maybe c6, but black is actually never going to fianchetto the bishop. Now you might be wondering, why do I know this, or why do I think it's creative? And the reason is because even though it's a slightly different position, one of the openings that I play a lot with white is this move b3, and after knight f6, bishop b2, there's this option to play d5, knight f3, and a move like g6. Now white can always trade the bishop for the knight and play d4 and something like e3, but if black develops the bishop on this diagonal instead of putting the bishop on g7, black is generally a little bit better. So when we get g6, Gukesh is hoping that Pragg will trade the bishop for the knight, but Pragg says no, and he plays the move knight to f3. So after knight to f3, we get bishop g7, knight bd2, castles, h3 is played here. Bishop d3 or bishop e2 are both moves, but Pragg was probably worried about this idea with h6, g5, and then a knight h5 in a certain situation. So he plays h3 here, we get c5, c3, and now we have the move b6. Now if black were to play h6 here, white will go bishop f4 with the idea that if black ever plays knight h5 or g5, you always retreat the bishop back to h2. So we get b6. Pragg plays bishop d3, we get the move knight to c6, castles, h6, bishop f4, and now we have the move knight d7. Now what black is aiming for here is to play e5 and break up this nice little triangle of pawns, also known as a pyramid of Giza here, with the pawns from b2 to d4 and f2 to d4 with this move e5. Pragg plays bishop g3, we get bishop b7, bishop e2, and now we have the move e5. Now bishop e2 is a very committal decision here from Pragg. Probably he didn't want to burn a whole lot of time when he plays this move, because you're gonna have to think for 30, 35, 40 seconds. Maybe you can go bishop b5, maybe you can play e4, maybe you can play c4. At any rate, you have a lot of options, but it's a situation where, as I said before, time does play a huge role, and so you kind of have to make the decision: am I going to burn my whole clock here and bet the whole game on this one move, or am I going to play a move, conserve some time, and just keep the game going and go with the flow? So Pragg plays bishop e2, which I think is objectively the correct decision, because he's also in a must-win game, meaning that when you're in a must-win game, you want to keep all the pieces on the board for as long as possible. So you got e5, takes, a4, knight d7, and now we get the move queen c2. Now again, white is not better here by any stretch of the imagination, but for Pragg, he knows that he's going to bring the rooks to the center, play for c4, e4, and he has easy moves, meaning the pressure is going to go on to Gukesh, who will have to come up with some ideas. So we get the move rook e8. Pragg plays rook e1, rook c8, rook d1, and now we get the move queen e7. Now this is a very severe error here according to the computer. I'm not going to fault Gukesh at all for playing this move, but knight f6 is apparently the top move according to the computer. Hard move to play because white has knight c4 due to the pin and threats like knight d6, but after knight c4 and knight e4, black would be better. So we get queen e7, and now Pragg plays move queen to b1 here. e4 is the move the computer is screaming for, and after takes, there's knight takes e4, takes, and rook d7, and white is a little bit better with this kebab on the 7th rank. Instead, we get queen b1, and now Gukesh plays knight f8, and this is a terrible decision. Gukesh here should have played the move knight to f6, trying to stop white from playing e4. Not sure why he played knight f8 exactly. I guess he probably thought that e4 wasn't going to be a big deal because of this pawn structure with e4, d4, but as it turns out, this is simply a misevaluation. So we got bishop f1. Knight e6 is played, and now Pragg goes e4, we get d4, and here we have the move queen c2, guarding the pawn on c3. Now, as I said, in blitz, a lot of what happens is it's about intuition and general assessment, and Gukesh has misevaluated this position. He thinks that his pawn on d4 is actually better than the white pawn on e4 in this pawn structure, but he is sorely mistaken, because as we're about to see, white is going to start creating a lot of threats on the dark squares around the black king. So here we got knight g5. Pragg plays knight to h2. Nice move as white prepares to play f4 and kick the knight out of town. We got rook d8, e5 played here, and now we got the move queen c7. Now Pragg plays move knight g4 after a 20-second thing, and this is a terrible move. Now I'm not going to fault the players. They're obviously tired, and it's easy to overlook things, but here are the moves that I would have recommended: is to play e6, opening up the diagonal for the bishop. After queen c8, takes, you have queen takes g6, and white is just doing great here. The knight is jumping into the action. You have bishop c4 to pin the knight on the diagonal, and white should be well on the way to a win. Again, players have been playing for a long time, the nerves are frayed and everything else, so we get the move knight g4. Now here Gukesh plays move king h8, and this is a mistake played after an 11-second thing. Now, the move that the computer wants is it wants black to take this pawn on e5. Very tough move to play, by the way, because you're walking into a massive pin here on the diagonal. You probably think there's maybe there's an f4 move. Maybe there's knight c4 here with these knights. But after knight c4, black is knight e to f3, forking the king and the rook. You take the knight. After takes, king h1 and knight e1. It's a fossil here, king in check, and you lose your queen and the game. So Gukesh, if he had found the move knight takes e5 here, he wins this game. Well, maybe wins this too much, but he does not lose this game at any rate. I shouldn't have said that. Oops. He does not end up in trouble in this game if he doesn't play knight takes e5, but he plays king h8 instead. Now Pragg goes knight c4, and look at these knights guarding the pawn. Knights have jumps to d6 and f6 with a pawn hook, and at this point, everything is going wrong. So we got knight e6 from Gukesh. Pragg plays knight d6 with the bastion forking the rook, the pawn, and the bishop. We get the move rook to f8, and now Pragg plays bishop c4, activating the bishop on the diagonal, and at this point black is in serious trouble, and the time situation does not help. So we get the move knight to e7. Pragg plays queen to c1 here, attacking this pawn on h6, and now we get the move queen c6. Now for Gukesh, he's lining up the double A battery to line up the checkmate, but we get the move knight takes bishop, ending any of these ideas. We get queen takes bishop, and now we have the move knight takes h6. At this point, white is simply up a pawn on the king side, and this is Pragg's game to lose. We get knight to d5, knight g4 back, queen e7, and now we have the move rook d3. Gukesh plays queen g5, we get the trade of the queens, and now the move pawn takes pawn is played. Now Pragg could have won the game on the spot with bishop to h4, pinning the knight. If you move the knight, you lose the rook, and materially speaking here, white has two rooks and a knight versus a rook, bishop, and a knight, and white will win the game. Instead, we get pawn takes pawn, knight b4, rook d2, and now we have the move rook takes pawn. We get the swap of the rooks. Pragg plays rook d1, and here we get the move knight c6. Now at this point, the most important thing is you want to simplify it from the white standpoint. You're up a pawn here. You want to keep it simple, because if you keep it simple, you're going to have easy moves to play, and your opponent will have to find some tough moves. And at this point, as you can probably tell from the eval bar, computer thinks that black is losing a second pawn, and it's all but hopeless. So we get knight c6. Pragg plays bishop b5, attacking the knight, which guards the pawn, and now we get to move knight e7. This move loses instantly, but already here is basically over. Even after rook c8, white can trade, play rook d4 here at knight e6, rook d7, and white has double attack of the pawns. You have 1 2 3 4 5 6. Black has 1 2 3 4 at the top level in chess with 2 extra pawns here. There's no doubt that from a technical standpoint, white will win the game. So we get knight e7 instead, and now Pragg spots this bishop h4 idea. He missed it the first time, does not miss the second time. Now both of the knights are under serious pressure, and here Gukesh decides to resign the game, because if he plays move knight e6, you take the knight. On e7, you're up a piece and winning, and if black plays f6, you take, and again you have one extra minor piece on the board. So after bishop to h4, we get a victory from Pragg on demand. He ties the matchup in the tiebreak at 1-1, and we now move to sudden death chess, not to be confused with sudden death dodgeball. Now the format for this is a little bit unusual. As most people know, in the World Rapid and Blitz Championship, which concluded recently in New York City, there was no Armageddon, meaning that the match could theoretically go on forever, and in Tata Steel they've done something pretty similar. Now there are a little bit of wrinkles here as we go into the sudden death portion of the event. The players will be playing with time odds, and what that means is the player who plays with the white pieces will play with 2.5 minutes, and the player with the black pieces will play with 3 minutes. They get a 2-second increment from move 1, but the goal is to create an imbalance, meaning that it's more likely to have a decisive game. So white gets 30 seconds less, they get 2 seconds from move 1, but somebody is likely to win, and whoever wins first does win on the spot. Now, of course, those of you guys who are watching this are probably thinking, well, can't they just agree to draws every game and not have to play? Yes, this is a possibility, but I think the players, they want to try and win. The title means a lot to them, and they are not going to do anything like what we saw with a share of first place in the World Blitz Championship. So we go to the first game of sudden death. Pragg gets the white pieces, 2.5 minutes on the clock, Gukesh with 3 minutes, and let's get into the action. So we get the move d4. Gukesh plays d5, we get knight f3, knight f6, and now Pragg plays the London system. Instead of playing the Trump house key, putting the bishop on this diagonal towards the queen, the knight, and the pawn, he now puts the bishop on f4. We get e6, e3, c5, and now Pragg plays move bishop e2. Gukesh plays bishop d6, we get pawn takes, bishop takes, and now the move castles, c4, and here we have the move pawn takes pawn. Now all this standard theory, so that's why I'm not giving a whole lot of comments. We get takes, a6, and now we have the queen trade and knight d2 from Pragg. Now when Pragg does this, you have to realize he's down 30 seconds on the clock, so he wants something a little bit simpler and easier to play in an endgame. So we get bishop d7. Pragg plays rook c1 here, putting the rook on the c file, and now we get to move bishop e7, avoiding any threats. For example, say you play king f8, white can play bishop takes pawn, and now your bishop on c5 will fall. So we get bishop e7, avoiding any threats on the file, and now Pragg plays bishop e2. Gukesh plays knight to d5, attacking the bishop on this diagonal, and we have the move bishop g3 on the board. Gukesh here plays the move bishop to b5, and this is a move that I really like here, because Gukesh is showing great understanding. Now, obviously, he faced the London system in his World Championship match against Ding Liren, so he's very familiar with this, but this shows great understanding, because the one problem black has here, let's say you go knight c6, and we have something like e4, knight f6, and knight c4, for example, or, sorry, knight c4 hangs upon e4, you get something like, I don't know, a3, is that black's bishop on d7 here is very passive. There's a knight in the way, there's a pawn in the way. Sure, you can go bishop e8 to open the file, but this bishop is just not a very active piece in this position. So when Gukesh goes bishop b5, he's getting rid of a passive piece here, and then he will develop the knight to c6. Now Pragg trades the bishops. He goes a3, does not want to hang this pawn, and now we get knight c6. Now, even though black has double b pawns here, black always has the option to play a move like h3 and b4 to simply get rid of this weakness. So the pawn on b5 is not actually a weakness here, and if anybody is better, it's probably black. So we get the move rook f d1. Gukesh plays rook c8, we get king f1, and now we have the move knight to b6, and Gukesh here is trying to maneuver his knight either to the c4 or a4 squares to hit these pawns on b2 and a3 via a4 or via c4. We get the move knight to e4 from Pragg, and now Gukesh plays knight c4. We got rook takes, rook takes, and here Pragg plays move rook c2, and this is a surprisingly serious error in the position. Now the computer here wants white to play the move a4, trying to undermine this pawn here, which guards the knight. If black takes the pawn, you lose the knight in the game, and if black plays knight takes b2, after pawn takes pawn, knight a7, now white has rook c7 attacking the pawn and the bishop, and as you can tell from the eval bar, white is going to win the game. Pragg instead plays rook c2. Now keep in mind, even at this point in the game, because Pragg started with a 30-second time deficiency, or time odds you could say, he does not want to get too low on time, so he plays the natural move rook c2 right away. Because he's down 40 seconds, you don't want to get down much more on the clock. So we get rook d1, king e2, and now after rook to b1, all of a sudden Pragg's pawns on b2 and a3 are under massive pressure here, and he is in some trouble. Now it's not losing or anything, but in a blitz game, and especially when you only have 58 seconds here and your opponent has a minute and a half, you have to make quick decisions, and that's why Pragg misses the only move that realistically could have held the glue in this position. Now the move that could have held the glue is a very unusual move, knight to d4 here, because after black trades, if black takes on b2, you can trade and then play the move bishop to d6 here, and after takes, suddenly both of the pawns on b5 and b7 are both under attack, and white is completely fine. Now with no time on the clock here, it's a very tough move to play, and so Pragg plays knight c3. We get takes, knight takes b5, and now after knight c4, Pragg plays move king d3. Now if Pragg were to play the move a4, trying to save this pawn from being captured, black simply goes knight to b2, and now you can't push the pawn. Black takes a juicer, and if you go knight c3, trying to guard it, after bishop b4 here, now your knight's under attack, pawn's under attack, knight a2, knight a4, for example, knight guards the bishop, you're going to lose this pawn on the rim. So Pragg makes a very good practical decision here. He plays king d3, we get takes, king c4, and now we have the move knight a7. Now Pragg is assuming that because it's only one lone pawn and black's king is far away, this white king can infiltrate and create enough counterplay before black can bring his king into the center of the board. So we get knight a7, great move from Gukesh here, stopping the white king from moving up the board here, and now Pragg plays bishop b8. Gukesh goes knight c8, and here we get the move king to b5, and this is the moment where Gukesh, with one extra minute on the clock, misses his chance to win the game on the spot. Now in this position, if Gukesh had played the move bishop to d6 here, white has no option other than to trade the bishops. If you go to a7, I take the bishop. If you leave it there, I take the bishop, and if you trade on d6, after takes, king b6, black has the move knight to e4, attacking this pawn. You cannot guard the pawn as the knight is in the way, and after king b7, knight f2, let's just say king c6, something like knight g4, e4, and f6, I have no doubt in my mind that with 1 minute more on the clock, Gukesh would have won this game. Instead, we get the move f6, and now after knight d2 is played, it's not quite the same situation, because if black goes bishop d6 here, after takes, and king b6, you'll notice the white knight covers both e4 and c4 here, and now after king f7, black is still a little bit better, but it's going to be very tricky to win this position after, say, e4, king e7, and f3. So we get king f7. Knight c4 is played by Pragg, we got bishop to f8, and now we have to move knight to a5, trying to go after the pawn on b7. Gukesh plays bishop d6 now, we get the trade, king b6 is played, and here Gukesh plays knight e4. Pragg goes f3 here. Of course, you do not want to hang this pawn on f2, so he attacks the knight, and now Gukesh plays move knight c3. Now this move is just simply a mistake here. If black wants to maintain any chance of winning the game, you have to play the move knight to d2, because if white were to take the pawn, after knight f1, you attack both the pawns on h2, and the pawn on e3, and after e4, knight h2, it's not losing or anything, but you have this extra h-pawn on the board. So we get knight c3. Now Pragg takes the pawn with a king, we get e5 here, and after the move king c6, now Pragg has an even position here, same number of pawns on the board. All he has to do is get his king back, and the game should end in a draw. But of course, this is a blitz game, so anything can happen if the players get low on time. We have knight d1, knight c4, king e6, and now Pragg plays move e4. Gukesh plays g6, we get king c5, and now the move f5 is played by Gukesh. We get king b4, takes, knight f2, and now Pragg plays knight d2, guarding the pawn. Here Gukesh plays king d6, we get knight c4, king e6, knight d2, and now Gukesh surprisingly plays the move king f6. Now this comes back to the way Gukesh is playing chess, which is he is playing every game to the end no matter what. There's nothing wrong with king f6 per se, but I think that in the last couple of games of this tournament, the luck is kind of running out. He's playing on no matter what, and he's kind of getting punished a little bit for it. So we have king f6. Now we get king c4, knight g4 is played. Pragg plays knight f1, guarding the pawn on h2 and stopping knight to e3. We got knight f2, and after the move king d5, now it's a little bit unclear exactly who is trying to win here, because the white king now is better than the black king. It's centralized, it's always targeting the pawn. Black can't ever move the king without losing the pawn on e5. So already here, black is the one who has to be careful to not end up in trouble. So Gukesh plays knight d3. Pragg plays knight e3 here. This knight guards the pawn on g2. We get knight f4, king d6, and now we have this move knight d3. Now this move loses the game from Gukesh here. He should have played the move h5 to try and stop white from going knight g4. Probably he was worried about knight d5 check, but after king g5, black is still okay here in this position. After takes, king d5, h4, white plays g3, takes, king f3, king f6, takes, and the game will end peacefully. But at this point, both players are low on the clock. You have like 8 seconds here. You have to trust your instinct, move in 2 to 3 seconds, and Gukesh instincts fail him here. He plays knight d3, and now after the move knight g4, checking the king and attacking the pawn, Pragg, if anybody has a chance to win, it will be him. So we get king g5, knight takes e5, and now Gukesh inexplicably plays this move king to f4, hanging this knight on d3. Now I'm sure at this point Gukesh was completely frazzled. He knows that he's messed everything up here, but still he should have tried something like knight to f2, and after knight f3, king f4, e5, maybe hope for a miracle with knight e4 and some kind of g5, g4. It is winning for white, make no mistake about it, but this at least gives you some hope, because when Gukesh plays move king f4, hanging the knight on d3, this is simply never going to work out. We get knight takes knight being played here. Gukesh plays king e4, we get knight to f2, king e3, and now we have the move knight g4. Gukesh plays king f4, and we get the move knight to f6, attacking the pawn. Now if Gukesh were able to get something like, let's just say something like this, for example, where the king is running close to the pawns, there are always some hopes of maybe being able to save the game here, but Pragg does not let him get any of that. So we get king f4, knight f6, attacking the pawn. Gukesh plays h5, and now Pragg brings his king ever closer towards the kingside pawns. Gukesh plays h4, we get king to f7, attacking the pawn. King f5 is played, sorry, not g5. We get king g7. Now we have g5, only move really. You can't push the pawn, I just take the pawn. And so we get g5, and now Pragg plays h3. Black can no longer push any of these pawns, and therefore after king f4 and king g6 is played, Gukesh resigns the game here, because the only move to play is king g3. But after takes, king f3 and king g5, white is going to push this piece up the board, get a queen, and win the game. So as this is sudden death, this means that with this victory with the white pieces, Praggnanandhaa wins the Tata Steel chess tournament in the year of 2025. An epic victory for him. Just shows great resilience, especially in this tiebreaker. Loses the first game, especially after a heartbreaking 7-hour game, which he at some moments he shouldn't have lost. Really shows that great fighting spirit. He comes back on demand, wins with white. This game he was losing, this sudden death one, but again keeps fighting, keeps the game going, and ultimately Gukesh makes the final blunder in this game, and that is why Pragg emerges victorious. So for Gukesh, overall a good tournament. A tough loss against Arjun today, which kind of ruins it a little bit. Nonetheless, he did show that it was no fluke that he won the world championship match. But in this event, my general feeling was at a certain moment he started to think he was a little bit invincible, if you could say that, where he could do anything and nothing could go wrong. And I think the gods, or chess karma, whatever you want to call it, at the end of the tournament they kind of punished him for being a little bit too overconfident, as he loses his third game against Pragg. He also loses against Arjun out of the opening. So I think kind of for Gukesh, it's actually a good thing that this happened, because it's going to bring him back down to earth a little bit, where you don't feel too invincible. You become a little bit more objective, and if he stays objective and he can kind of pick those right moments to go for it, the future is very bright for him. Obviously he's already the world champion, but I think it's good actually from an experience standpoint that he had these mishaps befall him on this final day of the tournament. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from round number 13, the final day of the 87th edition of the Tata Steel chess tournament being held in the Netherlands. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some more great content in the coming days. Hope you guys enjoyed it and have a great rest of your day. See you soon. Bye.